We're continuing on with our civil rights unit, and today we looked at civil rights through the lens of Native Americans. And I want to start off with two fairly heavy concepts, and the first being models of minority exclusion. So, throughout history and throughout the world, there's different forms of minority exclusion. And the first is an apartheid style model where a minority controls every aspect of society, like South Africa years ago, where 15% white population controlled a country that was 85% black. Now, the second one is more apropos to American Indians, economic and political disempowerment. Okay, dis meaning the opposite. Because if you think about it, before people arrived, they were empowered to do whatever they want, and that was taken away over time. And then this third model, this two-tiered pluralism. I hope you remember the idea of pluralism, that there are many different groups of people, a lot of diversity under one umbrella, and hopefully one goal, one vision, that sort of stuff. But really, it's the second one we're talking about here. And then I asked the philosophical question in class, and most students answered no, but I'll pose the question to you. Should the Native American experience be understood in terms of minority politics? Now, if you answered yes, you'd say they are a numerical minority, that's distinct from the racial majority, but most people said no. They were here first and saw widespread violations of their right by quote unquote immigrant groups, people coming over. So that's more for the philosophical underpinning before we get into the history. So if you look at the history, there's essentially three chapters. The first being sovereignty, that there was treaties between the U.S. and Indian nations, not tribes, nations. And then chapter two, this forcible assimilation. I know you know what forcible means, but assimilation means you have to blend in, you have to conform, you have to be like the majority. And then the third chapter is self-determination on reservations. So let's start off with the early days. And if you look at 1787 to 1871, 389 treaties. That's a lot. Now, whether they were honored or not, that's a different story. Now, in the Constitution, Indians are mentioned by name. Article 1, Section 2, excluding Indians, not taxed. Article 1, Section 8, federal regulation with commerce with Indian tribes. It's like with foreign nations. And then the Northwest Ordinance, obviously not in the Constitution, was it stated no Indian land could be taken without their consent except in the case of war declared by Congress. Except by war is probably the problematic language if you are an American Indian. Okay, now this sovereignty starts dwindling. Okay, so there was pressures to follow white land ownership patterns, and what we see here is this gradual taking away of their sovereignty. And there's three examples, and we're going to go over this when I'm done with this PowerPoint, or there's a worksheet, I should say, when we're done with this PowerPoint. Indian Removal Act, Worcester versus Georgia, and the Trail of Tears, which most of you remember. Very tragic, very sad event. I think most of you remember that from your history class. Now, forcible assimilation, you can really see this as ground zero being the Dawes Act. And the Dawes Act, which was in 1887, native lands transfers to individuals could be sold after 25 years. And there was this sale of quote unquote surplus land. It's really surplus, should be Indian land. And the result of this is in about 60 years, native lands went from 138 million acres to 90 million acres, and maybe even worse is the cultural aspect of it, where we're going to take your customs away, your religion away. You're going to learn, American education, not your native education. So this is a pretty dark chapter in their history. And then we look at the legislative grant of citizenship, 1924. Now, the goal of civil rights struggles for immigrant descent minorities. Now, for Native Americans, it was used to undermine what had been, in theory, a status above U.S. citizenship and the formal end of this notion of sovereignty. Now, when you look at the 14th Amendment, I know some of my sharper students say, hey, 14th Amendment. Well, the courts only selectively recognized these 14th Amendment issues. So, in a sense, it was the worst of both worlds. Okay, so this is similar to what's going on in Puerto Rico, where a legislative grant can always be reversed for subsequent generations, and that doesn't give anybody any peace of mind. Now, self-determination on reservations or assimilations. So, ending native rights, this termination resolution of 1953, 109 tribes were dissolved. Now, that's probably problematic to some of you, and it was kind of a precursor to this American Indian movement, and as you can see, it's still going on. And then we see these ideas of tribal sovereignty, the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act of '75, tribes on reservations increasingly acting in the place of states in terms of police powers. So really, we're seeing kind of a mixed bag here. Okay, I would say starting in '69, we see the trajectory going in an upward direction. And a little more detail about the American Indian movement. The American Indian movement is an American Indian grassroots movement, was founded in July of '68. And I think we're all noticing the '60s were the time for civil rights, big time. Now, initially centered in urban areas in order to address systematic issues of poverty, discrimination, police brutality against American Indians. Now, the American Indian movement soon widened its focus from urban issues to many indigenous tribal issues that American Indian groups have faced due to settler colonialism. Okay, so this is the movement that happened for the American Indians and brings us to these current debates. So here's some modern debates about American Indians. Who determines who is a member of a tribe? What is a tribe? Who is a tribe? Now, there's 245 tribes not recognized by the U.S. government, okay, or 245 nations not recognized. Now, if you're one of those 245, that might be really troublesome for you. Now, in terms of tribal economic development, so there's these revenue sources like gambling and cigarettes, and in a sense, a lot of people are saying it was a day late and a dollar short. Okay, so you can open a casino. Somebody in class said they have different fishing rights than non-Indians, that kind of thing. So that could be an attempt to rectify the history. Whether that's enough or that's a good thing, that's subject to debate. Okay, so these are the things. In terms of gambling issues, fishing issues, who is a member of a tribe? What is a tribe? This sort of thing. And where it becomes important to people is I've had students many times say, well, I have X amount of indigenous blood, Indian blood, American Indian blood, whatever you want to call it. Now, does that constitute enough to be part of it? Now, a lot of states, if you can genetically prove you are a quarter American Indian, you get to go to university for free. Okay, and you get some benefits associated with that. Now, every tribe has a different criteria. Now, the US government says it's a quarter. And again, this is going into some sociological things to what constitutes identity and race and that kind of thing. Not an easy question to answer, that's for sure. And we're looking at some positive things happening. Okay, if you look at population growth from 70 to 2000, almost 200% growth. Now, the question is, again, are you actually an Indian? Okay, much of the growth is not among tribally affiliated Indians. And this concept of pan-ethnicity, if you don't know what pan-ethnicity is saying, all the Indians need to be in the same, on the same page. And you see this, there was a pan movement in the Middle East, where all the Middle Eastern countries, there's a pan-African movement. Oftentimes, pan movements don't work because people are quite different. People's identities are very near and dear to them. So there's this idea of all the Indians banding together for political this and that. Difficult to do because again, these people are quite different from each other. And here's a piece of evidence that shows that things are moving in the right direction. This is an article from 2020. More Native Americans were elected to Congress Tuesday ever before. So we're seeing a movement in some political representation. So here's the big questions. You move from a sovereign nation to what? Looking at these old treaties and these constitutional rights, how do you get tribal recognition, economic opportunities outside of cigarette revenue and gambling revenue, like, that sort of stuff, and then resources for lobbying politically around gaming. So if you look at this, you think things are moving in the right direction, but let me counter this. However, core resources have been stripped. Land has been stripped, tribal governance has been stripped. Human capital on reservations are low. There's just not a lot of people. And then we have a growth in Indian identity amongst those with limited tribal ties. Essentially, hey, can I prove a quarter so I can get my college paid for, which isn't really buying into the bigger picture here. So to go full circle, to return to our initial question, can a politicized ethnicity grow from ethnics with a largely symbolic tie? Okay, we'll talk about that in class. But if you miss class, what I'm going to ask you to do is go to Google Classroom, and there are some questions here. So hopefully that video gave you a bit of an overview, and I want you to go into more detail of 6 of the items that we saw in the PowerPoint, and then I'm going to ask you to write a paragraph or two that incorporates all 6 of these and put it in a narrative style. You're telling the story of American Indians since 1787, and please infuse all of these terms above just for some reiteration, okay? So that is what we need to do, and I appreciate you watching.